In the afternoon of August the 16th, 1991, at Calcutta International Airport, a Boeing 737-200 from Indian Airlines was preparing to depart for a short domestic flight over to the northeastern city of Imphal. Once there, the crew was then supposed to make a short turnaround before continuing to their final destination of Dimapur, and the flight preparations were chugging along nicely. The aircraft they were planning on using for the flight had registration Victor Tango Echo Foxtrot Lima, and it had been delivered new to Indian Airlines back in 1977. Powered by two Pratt & Whitney JT8 Delta 17 engines, it had, at the time of this flight, accumulated 33,000 flight cycles in its 14 years of service. A relatively short and hard life flying on Indian Airlines' dense network of short sectors, which connected cities across the entire Indian subcontinent. Having said that though, on that Friday afternoon it was in a generally good mechanical condition with no recorded issues in its technical log. Now the route the pilots were planning for covered about 430 kilometers, which meant that the entire flight would normally last just over an hour. Short, but still relatively comfortable for the cockpit crew. And they consisted of a 37-year-old captain who on this day had 3,783 hours of total time, with 2,369 of those having been flown on the Boeing 737. He was going to act as pilot flying for this first leg, and in the right seat, acting as his first officer and pilot monitoring, sat another captain. A 26-year-old with 1,647 hours of flight experience, of which almost all of them, nearly 1,400 hours, had been flown on this same type. Now the final report didn't specify how it was possible for him to have upgraded to captain at such a low total experience. Normally an absolute minimum of 1,500 hours is required for that, which I guess he had, but it is actually possible that his low experience would hold one of the keys to this story. Anyway, behind them, 4 cabin crew members were taking care of the 63 passengers who were boarding for the flight, which meant that the total number of people on board would eventually be 69. And once the boarding was complete and the aircraft pushed back from its gate, the relatively short sector length would mean that the cockpit workload would stay relatively high, especially since this flight was also heading towards some quite tricky terrain. All preparations seemed to have followed normal procedures, and Flight 257 eventually left Calcutta at the time 11:54, 24 minutes past their scheduled departure time. After takeoff, the pilots then proceeded with their standard procedures, following directions from air traffic control, who eventually cleared them to climb to their planned cruising altitude of 29,000 feet. And during that first part of their flight, they also followed the airways filed in their operational flight plan, which had been assigned to guide them northeast across the plains of eastern India. Now their destination, Imphal International Airport, was located in the northeastern Indian state of Manipur, less than 100 kilometers away from the border with Myanmar. And the airport itself lay inside of a broad valley at an elevation of approximately 2,540 feet, surrounded on nearly all sides by steep mountainous terrain. In fact, within a radius of only a few dozen miles from the runway, several ridge lines climbed to heights well above 6,000 feet. And because of that, aircraft arriving towards Imphal and preparing for approach into its single runway couldn't just descend down towards the runway whenever they saw fit. Now instead, the pilots needed to execute something known as a step-down approach to make sure that their aircraft remained at safe altitudes until positioned correctly relative to the airport and the terrain. In order to achieve this, the procedures relied on several radio navigation aids, with the main one being the Imphal VOR, a radio beacon that was located at the airport itself. Now a VOR, or Very High Omnidirectional Range, is a type of nav aid that I have mentioned in several of my videos so far. And VORs forms the backbone of old school radio navigation. And they work by emitting 360-degree radials from its center, which can then be picked up by an aircraft's VOR receiver and show the exact bearing to and from the station. In practice, in this case, this meant that the crews approaching Imphal would use the VOR to find their exact track towards it, and then, in order to be able to descend below the highest of the surrounding hills, the aircraft would first need to fly over the VOR, and then enter into a specific procedure to finally align with the airport's instrument landing system. And then only once the localizer and glide slope of that ILS had been intercepted could the final descent down towards the runway then begin. Now, I will go into more detail about this procedure later, but it is important to understand that this system depended entirely on one important thing. The crew must always know exactly where the aircraft was, because the instrument landing system could only help with the very last part of the guidance down to the runway, not to position the aircraft accurately before that. And in mountainous regions, the difference between being exactly where the procedure was designed for the aircraft to be and not could obviously mean the difference between safe terrain clearance and a mountain straight ahead. Now, on top of this, the weather in this region often made navigation a bit tricky. Moist air moving through the surrounding hills frequently produced cloud layers that would drift across the mountains surrounding the valley and bringing down the visibility. So aircraft descending in towards Impal therefore often spent long portions of the approach inside of thick clouds, which obviously rendered the terrain outside of the cockpit completely invisible. So trusting the instrumentation and navigation procedures were absolutely crucial. Now, that might sound obvious for most of my frequent viewers, but I am highlighting this for a reason that will soon become clear. In any case, after finally leveling off at their cruise altitude of 29,000 feet, Flight 257 soon continued northeast across eastern India towards the hills of Manipur. For the first portion of the flight, the pilots followed their planned route northeast from Calcutta towards Bangladesh, after which the airway pointed them towards Kumilla, which served as a navigational waypoint before continuing inbound Agartala and finally on towards Impal. Now, up until this stage, nothing had happened in the cockpit that would imply that these pilots were doing anything else than what was expected from them. And as the aircraft continued eastwards, they soon started preparing for the arrival that every aircraft would have to go through before landing at this destination. Now, when we're on the subject of arrivals, this is something that you as a passenger should also be preparing for to some extent. Because one of the most irritating issues that you can easily protect yourself against is the lack of mobile data when you land and want to send a message home, get directions to your hotel or get an Uber. Using airport Wi-Fi is seldom ideal from a safety standpoint, and neither is paying through your teeth for local roaming. But today's sponsor, Saily, offers smart travelers a much better solution. Saily is an eSIM provider from the creators of NordVPN, and with them, instead of hunting for a local SIM card or getting hit with roaming charges, they offer instant mobile data in over 200 destinations. Here's how it works. You open the app, pick your destination and choose a data plan, a few days or weeks, whatever you need, and if you're traveling through multiple countries, the regional or global plans mean that you won't have to think about it at all. Saily is a truly global eSIM that will have you covered wherever you go. And since it is developed by the team behind NordVPN, Saily also comes with security built in. You can block malicious ads, change your virtual location, and keep browsing activity private, all within the same app. Right now, you can get a 15% discount using the code PILOT at checkout when you scan this QR code or go to saily.com/pilot. Thank you again, Saily. Now, let's get back to that approach preparation. When approaching from the southwest, this procedure began with the Impal VOR that I mentioned earlier, and since it sat directly on the airport itself, it served as the central reference point for the entire approach sequence. So crews that were approaching would first track directly towards the VOR until passing overhead it. And that beacon crossing was important, not only because it confirmed the aircraft's exact position, but also because it established the time reference and procedures used for the rest of the approach. Once the aircraft had passed the VOR, the crew would then begin the first part of the approach maneuver, which would be to enter into a holding pattern, where they could descend from a minimum of 10,000 feet down to 8,000 feet. And after established, that holding pattern would then align the aircraft for the subsequent, second phase, the procedure turn. On that segment, the aircraft would fly outbound from the VOR, following the outbound radial on a timed leg, normally lasting 2 minutes and 30 seconds, corrected for wind. And once outbound, the aircraft was also allowed to descend down to 5,000 feet. And since this whole maneuver ensured that everyone knew exactly where they were at all times, It also ensured that the aircraft stayed safely clear of any surrounding terrain. Now, when the timing was out on that leg, the aircraft would then execute a procedural turn and descend even further, down to 4,200 feet, which would finally point the nose back towards the airport and allow it to intercept the ILS for the approach down towards the runway. This type of timing-based navigation was, and still is, common at airports that lacks radar coverage like this one. The controllers there didn't have any screen that they could use to verify the aircraft's position or to provide them with radar vectors, so they had to assume that the aircraft were following the published procedures and that they could rely on any position reports that the pilots sent. But this also meant that if a crew for whatever reason would get lost or misunderstand where they were in the procedure, well, then the controller had almost no way of detecting that mistake. For the pilots, this meant that the procedure effectively created an invisible corridor through the mountains, and as long as the aircraft followed that correct sequence of headings, altitudes and timings, it would remain perfectly safe inside of the protected airspace. But if they took a wrong turn or began descending before reaching the correct positions, well, then things could go very wrong without anyone noticing it. Now, I know that this might sound very complicated and frightening, but this is exactly why we pilots need to get an instrument rating before we start flying these type of procedures and in limited visibility. If you end up getting lost, the correct thing to do is just to acknowledge it, climb back up to a safe altitude, and then turn back towards the beacon again. And we are examined on our instrument flying skills every single year. Also, today this situation would look quite different. Even at a relatively small airport, controllers often have access to surveillance tools such as ADS-B, which allows them to see an aircraft's position, altitude and track on a screen, even if traditional radar coverage is limited. And at the same time, modern airliners navigate primarily using GPS-based flight management systems that continuously calculate our positions with far greater precision than the radio navigation techniques available in the early 1990s. Not to mention how well our navigation displays now show us our location, which further increases our situational awareness. But on the day of this story, none of those extra layers existed. The only picture anyone had of the aircraft's position was the one built in the heads of the pilots in the cockpit by watching their instruments. Or at least, that's how they should have built their mental picture. As the pilots of Flight 257 continued their descent preparation at 29,000 feet, they were still well above any terrain, but soon the aircraft would start descending down towards lower altitudes, where terrain awareness started becoming critically important. And from that point, their entire safety margin would depend on one simple thing. They needed to know exactly where they were in relation to the IMPAL VOR. Just after the aircraft passed the area of Comilla, the first real deviation from the flight's filed flight plan suddenly occurred. The aircraft should at that point have continued tracking on a heading of approximately 007 degrees towards the navigation waypoint of Agartala, and from there the filed route would naturally bend northeast towards IMPAL, placing it on a path that aligned with the geometry of the normal arrival procedure. Now, that was not a coincidence. This route was designed to guide the aircraft into a position where they would pass directly over the IMPAL VOR before beginning the final sequence of maneuvers. But now, shortly after passing Comilla, the aircraft began drifting to the right of that course instead. Its heading slowly increased until it settled on a track of about 053 degrees, which was more than 40 degrees to the right of the airway that the pilots had been cleared to follow. This new heading aimed the aircraft almost directly towards IMPAL, bypassing Agartala entirely and effectively cutting off a corner of the route. So it now looked like the pilots were aiming directly for the endpoint of the downwind leg of the approach of the airport they were going to. This heading was then maintained for approximately 12 minutes as the aircraft continued northeast, and this deviation was not the result of any navigational malfunction or a momentarily lapse in attention. But investigators later found no evidence that the aircraft's navigational equipment had failed in any way, and nothing in the cockpit voice recorder suggested that the crew was confused about their position. Instead, this seemed to have been a deliberate decision by the pilots to just shorten down the route a bit. Or put it simply, they were taking a shortcut. On a sector like this, that change would save several minutes of flying time, and the maneuver itself was not unusual, particularly in airspace where radar coverage was limited and controllers relied heavily on pilot position reports rather than real-time tracking of aircraft. But the fact that it was normal didn't really make it less of a rule violation, especially since it wasn't cleared by the controllers in any way, shape or form. And that also gives us a first glimpse of how these two pilots operated. This is something that we refer to as normalization of deviance, a term that was first popularized in the analysis of the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, where it was found that engineers had gradually become accustomed to small anomalies that hadn't yet caused a failure. And because those deviations from the expected didn't immediately produce a catastrophic result, they slowly became accepted as normal. That exact pattern can also emerge in flight operations, particularly on routes that crews fly frequently. And in this case, the captain, who remember was pilot flying here, had made this exact flight 36 times before. Now, when a pilot discovers that a shortcut consistently saves time without immediately creating any problems, that shortcut can begin to feel routine rather than wrong in any way. So, over time, that deviation from the published procedure becomes integrated into the pilot's mental model of how this flight should normally be done, even though the written procedure still exists for a reason. But in this case, the aircraft just continued steadily along its new self-selected heading, whilst the pilots carried on with their normal duties. And even though this shortcut didn't immediately place the aircraft in any danger, it had quietly begun altering the geometry of the arrival that would soon follow. After having kept the 053-degree track for roughly 12 minutes, the aircraft then turned even further to the right, with its heading increasing to approximately 081 degrees. That placed the aircraft on a track that still pointed generally towards Impal, but now from a position significantly south of the route that it would normally take. That heading was then held for another 9 minutes before the crew adjusted slightly back to the left, eventually stabilizing the aircraft on a track of around 070 degrees. At the same time, the pilot monitoring transmitted a position report to air traffic control, which further complicated the situation, because what he now reported was that they had passed over Agartala, when in reality the aircraft was nowhere near that waypoint. And because, like I mentioned, the ATC region between Comilla and Impal had no radar coverage, the controller had no way of verifying the aircraft's location. So, when hearing that Flight 257 had passed Agartala, the controller just assumed that the aircraft was following the standard planned route. After all, he had no reason not to take the crew at their words. Back in the cockpit, however, the pilots obviously knew that they were now cutting the corner, and this shortcut had now also changed the crew's estimated time of arrival, which would now be 12:42 local time, approximately 4 minutes earlier than their previous estimate. Now that's not a lot, and might seem inconsequential, but it still subtly influenced the next decision that the crew would make. You see, according to the operational flight plan, the descent down towards Imphal was expected to begin roughly 45 minutes after departing from Calcutta. So taking this new arrival time into account, that descent should have started around 12:35 local time. But for some reason, the pilots now asked for descent even earlier. The descent was initiated approximately 6 minutes before what the revised arrival time would have suggested, which could indicate that the crew thought that they were even closer to Impal than they really were. And that belief might have been reinforced by the aircraft's higher true airspeed compared to the value that they had used for their flight planning calculations, which would make the flight appear to be progressing faster than expected. But because they had now also bypassed the navigational points that normally establish the timing and geometry of the arrival, the crew had by this point already lost the structured reference that their planning relied on. On top of that, it's good to remember here that whilst they had the VOR RMI showing them where the beacon was, they didn't have anything showing the distance to it. But inside the cockpit though, everything pointed to the pilots believing that the arrival was unfolding completely normally. The aircraft was also tracking generally towards the airport, and the instruments in front of them showed no obvious indication of any increased threats. But that mental picture had now started deviating ever so slightly from reality. In aviation, we refer to that internal picture as spatial awareness. This is the pilot's continuous understanding of where the aircraft is in space, how it is moving, and how that movement relates to the surrounding environment. Maintaining that awareness is obviously crucial, but it becomes acutely important in areas with mountainous terrain, where safe flight depends not only on controlling the aircraft, but also on ensuring that the aircraft remains within that narrow corridor of airspace where terrain clearance is guaranteed. And that crucial awareness had now started to slip, but it would get even worse. At around time 12:38, while Flight 257 continued descending towards the approach environment, the captain began looking outside and commenting on the terrain that he could see through the gaps of the clouds below. The cockpit voice recorder captured him attempting to identify landmarks in the landscape, saying, "This is one hill, that is another hill, and in between the two." And using those visual cues, he soon concluded that the aircraft was approximately 25 nautical miles away from Impal. The terrain he was looking at, however, in reality didn't belong to the valley surrounding the airport at all. Instead, it was part of the rugged terrain south of the valley, including the hills of the Tangyang range, which had peaks over 6,000 feet high. A minute later, the crew transmitted another position report to the controller. "Impal Tower, Indian Airlines 12 miles inbound." And that suggested that the aircraft was now only 12 nautical miles away from the airport, which would mean that the crew was nearing the point where the arrival procedure would eventually begin. But in reality, the aircraft was still about 15 nautical miles southwest of the VOR. So believing that they were closer to the VOR than they actually were, the crew now requested clearance to proceed directly onto the outbound leg of the holding pattern rather than first crossing the beacon. And this request was quickly granted by the Impal approach controller. But remember how the overflight of the VOR was really important for establishing location? Yeah, because they would now skip that part. Instead of flying the procedure from a known point in space, the crew of Flight 257 were now attempting to reconstruct the approach based solely on their estimate of where the aircraft should have been, as well as some ground features along their path, which they had already misidentified. Like I mentioned earlier, we sometimes do similar shortcuts today, but those are backed up by GPS coordinates and distance measuring equipment, not dead reckoning and assumptions. In any case, as they now continued descending south of the airport, the pilots soon began maneuvering the aircraft as though they were already inside of the protected airspace of the arrival procedure. Roughly 14 nautical miles southwest of the VOR, they reported that they were established on the outbound leg, and shortly afterwards, the aircraft turned to the right as the crew prepared to continue the descent associated with the next stage of the approach. But of course, the aircraft was not actually within the holding pattern. Instead, it was flying among the hills southwest of the airport, well outside the protected area of the approach procedure. As they continued the maneuver, the heading gradually changed from roughly 196 degrees towards about 210 degrees, while the descent also continued. And by that point, the pilots had descended to approximately 6,880 feet, placing the aircraft only a few hundred feet above some of the highest ridge lines in the area. But inside of the cockpit, everyone still believed that they were flying the outbound leg of the arrival procedure. At time 12:44, the captain commented on the progress of the procedure and said, 2 minutes up. He was referring to the expected timing of the outbound leg before beginning the turn backwards towards the airport, but the actual time that had elapsed since starting the maneuver was only about 1 minute and 35 seconds. So even if they had been in the correct position, they would have now started that procedure turn too early. Now, because the aircraft had never crossed the Impal VOR in the first place, the signals that normally confirmed its position within the approach procedure never appeared. And as a result, the instruments that would normally guide the crew into the holding pattern would have looked nothing like they should. And this is the part that I just don't understand. I have done videos about pilots getting lost before, but in all of those cases there were things that could be misunderstood or misinterpreted. But here, the VOR RMI in their cockpit should have clearly shown that they weren't tracking the correct outbound radial at all. So the only logical explanation was that the captain, who thought that he was very familiar with this route, was now just vibe feeling this entire approach, based loosely on previously identified visual cues, and possibly just by choosing indications in the cockpit that felt that it gave him vindication of his perceived position. And what his pilot monitoring was doing, I just have no idea. Obviously, it's the duty of both pilots to be fully aware of the aircraft's position at any given time, but there was nothing on the cockpit voice recorder indicating that the other captain had any issues with what they were doing. Maybe that was because he trusted his colleague or because he didn't want to speak up for some other reason. We will never know. But this lack of cross-check and communication is just truly heartbreaking to see. And of course, this was all happening at the same time as the terrain that might have alerted the crew to their mistake now remained hidden beneath a thick layer of cloud that was covering the hills south of the valley. So all of this meant that Flight 257 now just continued along its heading of roughly 210 degrees whilst descending through the cloud layer, with both of its pilots blissfully unaware of the mountain ridges that were now lurking only a few hundred feet below their indicated altitude. Inside of this cockpit, nothing except their navigation equipment would have appeared immediately unusual. The aircraft remained fully controllable, the instruments displayed no abnormal warnings, and the crew believed that they were following the correct sequence of the approach procedure. So from their perspective, the next logical step would now be the turn back towards the airport that would eventually place them on the inbound course of the ILS, an ILS that they would obviously never find. So what about the ground proximity warning system then? Shouldn't it warn them of any terrain that was coming up close to them? Well, not quite. And that was because this particular 737 was fitted with an early model of the GPWS, which had begun appearing in commercial aircraft during the 1970s. This version worked by monitoring the aircraft's altitude and descent rate relative to the ground directly beneath it, using its radio altimeter. And if that system detected that the aircraft was descending towards the terrain below it too rapidly, it would trigger an alarm warning the crew to climb immediately. But that system had a critical limitation. These early GPWSs could, like I mentioned, only detect terrain directly below the aircraft, not any terrain that was rising ahead along the flight path. So in areas where mountains could suddenly rise up from the flat ground of a valley, for example, this meant that the warning often arrived only moments before impact, since the system would not recognize the danger until the aircraft was potentially already close to the terrain. In decades since, several technological changes have dramatically changed the picture. Modern aircraft are equipped with something known as Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, or EGPWS, which uses detailed terrain databases and GPS positioning to warn crews about rising terrain ahead of the aircraft, rather than only directly below. And in addition, GPS-based navigation and cockpit moving map displays now also allow pilots to see their exact position relative to terrain and their approach procedures in real time. So together, these systems have made situations like this one very difficult to repeat. But like I said, Flight 257 didn't have this kind of technological foresight, so its pilots now continued along its descending track through the clouds in between the forested slopes of the surrounding hills. At time 12:46 and 4 seconds, Impal Approach called Flight 257 up to give them an update from the field, telling them that, approaching from the east, part of the airfield is under rain. But the controller never got any response back. 12 seconds later, he therefore called them up again and asked for their current altitude, still without getting a response, and the reason for that was that as these calls were being made, the quiet cockpit had suddenly been interrupted by the sharp GPWS warning calling out,
"Pull up! Pull up!"
Now startled by this warning, the pilots reacted almost immediately. The control column was pulled backwards as they tried to pitch the aircraft up, but they were now already too close for the escape maneuver to actually succeed. So, at time 12:46 and 23 seconds, the aircraft impacted the forested slope of the Tianjin range at high speed, tearing through trees as the fuselage disintegrated across the steep terrain. And all 69 occupants were likely instantly killed on impact. Now, the approach controller continued several times to try to get into contact with Flight 257, but without any success. Other aircraft in the area were then asked to try contacting the flight on both air traffic and company frequencies, but no one ever received any response. So by time 12:55 p.m., the airport declared a full emergency. Firefighters, ambulances and search teams were mobilized while nearby aircraft attempted to look for signs of the missing jet, but poor visibility and heavy clouds made the search quite difficult, and aircraft were eventually forced to abandon their attempts to try and find it. Hours later, villagers in the mountainous Jiang Hill region reported having seen the wreckage of an aircraft, which meant that rescue teams eventually reached the site roughly 5 to 6 hours after the crash, where they found the remains of Flight 257 scattered across the steep forested slope about 37 kilometers southwest of Impel Airport at an elevation of roughly 6,700 feet. The investigation eventually determined that the crash had not been caused by any mechanical failure of the aircraft, but instead it was the result of a breakdown in navigation and situational awareness by the cockpit crew. The investigators concluded that this accident was a classic case of controlled flight into terrain resulting from navigational error and loss of position awareness. And in response, the recommendations emphasized stricter adherence to published instrument procedures, improved crew training in situational awareness during non-radar operations, and clearer guidance on verifying position before descending into mountainous regions. But I feel that there's another thing here that's also worth highlighting, and that's the critical role of the pilot monitoring. It is absolutely crucial that you pilots out there understand that the monitoring pilot needs to do just that, monitor. Because mistakes are still made, and the person with a lower workload is often the one who will recognize it first. And if that happens, it must be clearly called out to make sure that the aircraft returns to safe flight, and that can sometimes only be achieved by an active pilot monitoring. Now, in our virtual Boeing 737 course that I have linked to in the description below and hopefully somewhere here on the screen, Ben and I talk about these things and how real Boeing 737 pilots actually work in a modern cockpit. If you are curious about that, or maybe fly simulators and want to do that more professionally, then please check out the course. It comes very highly recommended by our previous participants. Also, check this out. That's from our latest Black Box episode, and a new one is soon about to be released, so make sure that you are subscribed to that channel. I'll be linking to the channel in the end cards. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.